Welcome to our latest Book Reporter Talks to interview, where I'm so delighted to have Alexis Schaitkin here with us today. She's the author of Saint X, which I am absolutely crazy about. This book is going to be a Book Reporter Bets On selection. It's just out today, and we're going to be reviewing it this week on the site. It's just wonderful. It's a debut thriller that's been described as a haunting picture of grief, obsession, and the bond between two sisters. And it's a real combination of a murder mystery and a coming-of-age story. I'm seeing a little bit of both as I was reading it. I just love this book so much, and I'm so looking forward to talking to you about it. So welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Now, we met at Winter Institute a couple of weeks ago in Baltimore,
right.
And I heard you talk about the book because it was one of the Indies introduced titles that the independent booksellers has selected. And it was just wonderful to just hear you say a couple of words and be interviewed a little bit, but it made me want to talk to you even more. So let's start. If you could give us a little bit overview of the story of Saint X.
Sure. So in Saint X, a family from New York City travels to a Caribbean resort for their family vacation in the mid-1990s. And on the last night of their vacation, their teenage daughter, Alison, goes missing. And a few days later, her body is found. And this becomes international news. It's, kind of a tabloid sensation, a public media obsession. But the case is never solved. It remains a mysterious death. And about 20 years later, her much younger sister, Claire, is all grown up and she's living and working in New York City when a kind of brief coincidental encounter brings her into contact with Clive, who was a local who worked at the resort and was briefly a suspect in her sister's death. And without revealing to him who she is, she insinuates herself into his life to try to understand what really happened that night and what really happened to her sister. So, kind of like you said, it's, I almost like to think it's a story with a mysterious death, but it's not quite a murder mystery. It has that part to it, but I think ultimately it's very much about this aftermath 20 years later in which Claire and Clive find themselves and how they're both kind of putting their lives together in the wake of losing a sister, being
charged with a crime,
a suspect in this case, and so it's very much about this aftermath and also Claire's attempt to figure out what happened to Alison.
Yeah, because Claire at the beginning of the book is 7 years old.
Right.
Her sister is a much older teenager. She's in her late teens, I think and so as a result, there's an age gap between the two sisters. So I think that she's also doing a lot of wondering of who her older sister was that she kind of idolized as well.
Exactly. I mean, I think, it's interesting because one of the original working titles I had for the book was Myths of Alison, because I think there are so many versions of who was this teenager that the book really swirls around. And in a way, Alison becomes one of these sort of really famous, dead girls in the media, and so there is this kind of media version of her. But Claire also doesn't really know who she really was. She's 7 when her sister dies. Her sister was 18. And so in a way, Claire has this sort of hazy, beautiful, perfect image of her sister, just like some of what gets, put out in the news. And so, right, I think for Claire, there are really two simultaneous mysteries that she's trying to solve. She's trying to solve the mystery of what happened to her sister, but she's also really trying to understand, who was she? Who might she have become if she'd had the chance to grow up? And so she, there's this deep dive into, what did everybody write about her sister when she died? There are documents, there are fake newspaper articles, there's all of that as Claire kind of gets pulled into this obsession with simultaneously solving her sister's case and solving the secondary mystery of who she lost.
Yeah, because it was, she was 7. And her sister was good with her. She'd say, oh, let's go play in the sand. Let's go do this, that. And at the time, Claire's also doing this thing where she's writing in the air, which I found was like a little quirk of hers that she was doing. And her sister tolerated it. And her parents made them crazy. But her sister was like, oh, this is something she's just doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I saw this always as a story about like kind of paired relationships between people who are really, really different from each other. And Alison and Claire are so different. Alison, to some degree, it's how the media portrays her after her death, but she really is a pretty charismatic, a really sharp and intelligent teenager. She's really pretty. She, is just one of these people who kind of moves through the world pretty effortlessly, and is really aware of that. And that was the kind of character I was really interested in. Like, what would it feel like to be inside of somebody who just has this supreme confidence and this boldness and this daring personality? But Claire, on the other hand, is quite awkward and shy and really not at all at ease just in the world and has trouble making friends. And so, one of the things I was interested in is like that dynamic between them. But also, for Claire, like Alison was the person who embraced everything about her and just really loved her as she was. And I think, some of the things that made Claire a little awkward, a little shy, like worried her parents, right? Alison was never worried. She just loved her. She was her baby sister. And so I think for Claire, it's the loss of a sister. It's also the loss of someone you never really got to have that grown-up relationship with. But I think it's also like the loss of the one person you felt was sort of smoothing the way for you.
She was your champion.
Yeah,
she was her champion,
absolutely.
and it was so clear.
Yeah.
You definitely conveyed the sense of island life, that this family is on their very privileged holiday vacation.
Yeah.
It's like more fries with that. I'll have the salad with no dressing. And there's there are two different layers at these kinds of resorts. There are the people who are sitting in the beach chairs, and there's people who are bringing everything to the people that are in the beach chairs. And they're really two separate cultures in the place. And a lot of times the people who are there being served don't really even understand the rest of the culture. Like, they don't think about where they go home to sleep at night. They don't think about anything to do with that. And I think that you did a really good job of portraying both sides of the island life. So what was that like for you of, just making the decision, let's show both sides?
Well, thank you so much, first of all. But I wouldn't even call it a decision, because I think that was kind of what I went into with the initial idea of the book was, the Caribbean resort was for me like the initial kernel for the resort, and the initial kernel for the book. It wasn't, there is this mysterious death, and that's very much what I think drives the plot and the story. But that setting is really where I started for exactly the reasons that you said. I've always found it so interesting. It's a really confined space. It's a bubble. And within that bubble, like affluent, mostly American tourists and like island residents who work at the resort are interacting, for this really compressed, often week, where they get to know each other, and there's interactions that are, pretty intimate, and then they're both gone from each other's lives forever. And so I knew from the beginning that was kind of the story I wanted to tell, was how something that happened during one of these week-long vacations would kind of echo out and reverberate in the lives of characters who had been tourists at the resort, characters who worked at the resort, and kind of getting beneath, I think like a resort is designed to look like paradise and to be just perfect and beautiful and kind of without context. I refer to it early in the book as a lovely nowhere, and I think for a lot of the tourists that's what it is. And so I was really interested in kind of starting there. The first chapter of the book all takes place at the resort, but then the book opens out and out and out, and you kind of get more and more deeply into the lives of, Clive and Edwin, who also works at the resort, but also of their mothers, their girlfriends, their like band of brothers, because they have a really close group of friends who they grow up with. So that was kind of the idea from the inception.
And you realize that all these people are living on the same island at the same time. The people who are vacationing there are there with the people who are living there. I remember a couple of years ago, many years ago actually, at this point, we were on Virgin Gorda, and we decided to walk to the baths. And they ran shuttles to the baths. They took, all these different places to go out to this, landmark place on the island. So we decided we were going to walk. And literally, when we told them, they said, well, what time do you think you'll be back? Because if you go missing, we want to know how to find you. My husband's going, we're just walking out this. But it was, and we passed a group of school kids that were playing after school, and it was so refreshing to see something besides what was in the bubble of the resort, as you say, because you saw where people actually went home too. Like, what was the rest of the island like? And we remember driving around Barbados, and you realize that, well, these are all the people who are working at dinner. This is where they live. It's not like they fly someplace else at night, you know?
Yeah, and I think Alison, for me, Alison is kind of the way into a story that bridges, you know, I think the conventional way of saying it is, oh, these characters are all from two different worlds, but they're really not, right? They're from the same world. They're from worlds that are really bound up together. And that was what I was really interested in exploring. And I think Alison, as this kind of privileged and somewhat cynical teenage girl who's really grappling with her privilege and being from this affluent, she's from an affluent suburb, and she goes to Princeton, and I think she is sort of looking around this resort at a lot of people who are just very happy to not leave and not know where they are, and I think has this kind of desire to know where she really is. And that kind of sets off a lot of the events in the story.
And she also sees a lot of people like her. She sees a lot of kids like her there.
Yeah.
And is she looking for them, or is she looking for, and everybody always wants to escape and go see what the real world is like when you're on these islands. And these kids take off on these adventures at night, and they're hanging out with these people, and there's drinking, and there's whatever going on. And yet they're going to go back to their very privileged room, and somebody else is going to be making up their bed.
Right. And I think that irony is very much in the book. I think the sense to which, and I think, you know, I think Alison is aware of it herself, that she wants to get out of her bubble. She wants to have a sort of like quote unquote authentic experience, and yet there's also something very privileged about that, about wanting to go out and have an experience and take it home with her.
Right.
And so I think, you know, I think there are all of those layers that she's grappling with, and I was just really interested in exploring all of that kind of questioning through a teenager who, you know, is thinking about all of this, hasn't maybe quite figured out how to think about it, wants to just be bold and go out and have some kind of big, memorable experience.
Just do something completely different.
Yeah.
So you created Saint X instead of using any island. What were some of the reasons you decided to create an island of your own?
Yeah.
It's always fantasy to create an island of your own.
I thought so much about that choice. I mean, I think it was a choice that kind of started out instinctive, and then I sort of kept interrogating it. And the reason initially why I wanted to create a fictional island was because, you know, it's unnamed. It's fictional, but it also doesn't have a name, right? It's just Saint X. And that the idea there is that it is sort of this ironic nod to the way tourists interact with this place, right? It's not about, I think, the novel really starts with that tourist gaze of they're coming somewhere, they just want to lie on the beach and not really, and leave without ever really understanding where they were. And so it sort of begins with that. But as the novel progresses, you do dig really deeply into this place, and it becomes really specific. And so my hope is that by the time you reach the end of the novel, like the reader's relationship to that name evolves. So that artistically was the reason, but there were also some like very practical reasons. So not practical, I guess I would say, just I think that so much of the story is about how Alison's death becomes a huge news story. You know, it's an international news story. It becomes something that, like, very, very, in a very real way, impacts the tourism economy of this island and becomes sort of what people internationally think of when they think of this place. And so it becomes something that people who live on the island have really strong feelings about, because it's how they're known internationally. And so to take all of that and transpose it onto a real island and basically create an alternate history of a real island just seemed like a really bizarre undertaking that I didn't want to do. And so I think it was sort of for the same reasons as if you were going to create a story like this and put it in any small community that you would invent. I think it's one thing to take a story like this and put it in New York City or Kingston, which have like over 1 million people, but this is an island. The fictional island has about 12,000 residents, and so to put that somewhere real just
Be
seemed like
tough.
sort of an
Yeah.
odd endeavor.
Well, it's so funny because to this day, when you think Aruba, you think Natalie Holloway. I mean, you constantly think that. Which my theory, after we spent part of our honeymoon on Aruba, I always thought it was somebody from Venezuela came and kidnapped her. That was always my feeling, and I was like, was that ever explored? Was that ever really talked about? But it's once again, I thought about that here, but you go so much deeper with what you end up talking about. I was with Natalie for about 2 seconds, and then you brought me to a different place.
Yeah, it's funny. I've definitely been asked a lot, is it based on Natalie Holloway? And I think that if you kind of read the back cover, you might be getting those vibes, but it goes in a really different
direction, completely different.
Yeah.
But I do love that resorts have such a closed-door setting that it really gives you a chance to explore the story. You can get into the characters because you basically know how the day is going to go. You're going to get up, you're going to go to your beach chair, you're going to go this, that, the other thing. So as a result, you get to explore character a lot more and how she's viewing the beach, how her parents are viewing the beach. Her father wants to make sure he's getting every dime's worth of what's going on and financially, and they want to make sure they're having all the fun they can possibly have. And what is he, and I think that it's that closed door kind of a thing because you also have this whole other circuit of people that you're just going to get involved with the whole week as well. And you're going to get to know them.
And I think the way the novel is structured, you kind of return to this week 3 times and see it from 3 different angles. And so that, I think, like you said, it's this really confined. It's a really confined place. The rhythm of the days is very repetitive, and so, but viewing it from all of these different perspectives and all of these different characters, I think the same things look very different.
Yeah, because their day is completely different. I remember years ago I was working at Condé Nast and we did sales meetings in the Caribbean. That's where we would end up going. And we would go down and work on the setup. And by the time we were ready to leave, I remember when we were at, I can't remember which one it was, they put us in a Rolls Royce to send us to the airport. And everybody's going, oh, isn't this really nice? The people who had organized with me, they said they sent us in the Rolls Royce. And I said, no, do you understand? They never want to see us come back. And I said, if our flights are canceled, we need to go to another resort because we've driven these people so crazy. Yeah. So you're thinking this is this really great thing, but trust me, they never want to see us again.
But and also you can't remember which one it was, which
I can't remember exactly.
That was sort of so much of what I was interested in exploring because I think that I think the Caribbean kind of occupies a very specific place in the American tourist imagination in general, where I think, it is, for a lot of people, like the vacation, the goal is escape. The goal is not what it might be when those same people travel somewhere else. And so that was something I was really interested in. And I was interested in, from the other side, like, what is it like to, grow up and live in a place that to other people is just, a beach, and they're not super interested in, and I'm not saying everybody.
No.
But
it's
not, I think people, it's not, it's sort of, I was just almost interested in, like people who might go on a vacation somewhere else and be going to museums or be going to the Caribbean. I think somehow for a lot of American tourists, it's like an exception. And
you drop in a zone.
And so I was really interested in exploring that dynamic.
Yeah. One of the first times we went skiing, we were out west, and there was this woman who was helping her kids get out of all their ski gear and stuff, and she says, he thinks this is a really fun vacation. A week on the beach in the Caribbean would have been so much easier. And I always remember that line. She says, these ski vacations are so much work. You're carrying everything. She says, you just take the towel, the sunblock, and the book, and you go to the beach. And I was laughing because that's the whole aura that I think goes on to those kinds of trips. So your alternate setting is Brooklyn, and she's going to be living up in Brooklyn. What made you decide of all parts of the country, like she was going to go there?
Well, I think partly it's because it's a place I know, but I think she's sort of part of the idea with Claire is that she, always really struggled, and she was pretty awkward and pretty shy, and Alison was like her knight in shining armor, and then strangely, after Alison dies, life gets a little easier for Claire. Maybe not so strangely. She just kind of grows into herself and starts living this life where she's got friends. She has boyfriends in high school. She, does well in school. She gets a job in publishing in New York. And so where would she live? Well, of course, she would live in Brooklyn. And so part of it is about that just being such a conventional, like, destination for a young like affluent kid right now.
Right.
And because I think part of her journey is sort of understanding the degrees to which this life she feels like she has built for herself is resting a little bit on, what's the saying, it's a house of sand. It's, you know, she hasn't fully dealt with these things in her past. But I think, you know, initially Brooklyn was just like, well, of course, she's working in publishing. She would live in Brooklyn. And it's also a place where she would come in. So she crosses paths with Clive.
Right.
So it's a place where she might, you know, be in proximity with Clive. But as I kind of kept writing it, I really came to see St. X and Brooklyn as these sort of mirrored settings, because they're both, and this is like kind of the worlds I'm really interested in, they're both places where, you know, an affluent white girl like Claire and Clive, who, you know, is Black and lives on this island and then, you know, immigrates to New York, are living within a couple blocks of each other,
Right.
And exploring worlds that are that way, and where people who have these really different backgrounds, different nationalities, are just in close proximity to each other and looking at, you know, how do they interact with each other, how do they perform for each other, how do they perceive each other, how do they misperceive each other. All of that I was really interested in, and it's going on both, you know, on this island and in Brooklyn. And they're both places, you know, the novel takes place over a really long, not a really long time frame, but, you know, it begins with Clive's childhood in the early 70s up to the present day. And so you really see how both of these settings transform really dramatically, because, you know, when Clive and Edwin and their friends are growing up, the resorts have not opened up yet on the island.
Right.
It's a completely different place. And then, you know, all of this investment comes in and the life completely changes. And he sort of then gets to Brooklyn in the mid-90s, and just in time to sort of watch the same thing happen there.
Same thing happens all over, yeah.
So there are these like wrenching transformations that both places go through sort of in parallel.
You know, but we feel both the island sun and then the frigid New York. We're getting both of those. And what I was also seeing in the X, and I don't know if you've thought about this, there's a cross between she and her parents, she and her sister. There are these juxtapositions between these two people throughout. And I felt that it could have been Saint Y, it could have been Saint Z. Being that it's Saint X, I just saw how many times people are at different crossroads together. And I felt when I was looking at this on the book, the X, which is so beautifully portrayed, says so much as well about just giving you an eyeball into what you're going to be seeing, because it's not going to be defined. It's coming to a crossroad.
That's really well put. And I hadn't even thought about that, but definitely. And I also think for me, why X, for me it was sort of X marks the spot. It's this sense of mystery, and Claire's really trying to chase after the sense of the truth. And that's really her journey.
And St. X has left so many open questions for so many people. They've left him for Clive. They've left him questioning about his life. She's questioning of hers. And I just feel that the title works so beautifully with what ends up going on and unfolding in the story. And when I first picked it up, I was like, St. X, oh, I don't get it. And the more I've been thinking about the book, and I've been thinking about it since I read it a long time ago, because I just thought it was so well executed. Because you go in thinking it's going to be a novel about a family at the beach, and something happens to them. And this layer where she runs into Clive again, and the way she runs in, which I'm not going to share, is something that I've often done looking at when I'm in the particular place. And you start to wonder, who are these people? Who is what's going on? You hear a lyrical Caribbean accent speaking to you, and it's you wonder, but how would it be if you saw somebody that was that closely identified with your life, but that you didn't know?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I usually find titles incredibly difficult, and I usually hope that someone else will come up with one for me. And with this book, I had that title and that right away, and I think it's connected to, I always, when I'm writing, my starting point is not, like, my very, very, very first feeling about a book is less this character or this scenario. It's really like a feeling of how I want the reader to feel as they read the book. And I think for this book, so much of the tone for me is about these characters just being haunted for years and years and years by, as you said, there are mysteries for all of these characters, and there are different mysteries for all of these characters. And so I think the book's title, which has that slightly enigmatic feeling, for me captures that tone of just all of these characters are trying to solve their own mysteries.
Solve mysteries, so what's going on. Well, that brings me to my next question, is you use voice quite cleverly in the book, because at some places they're first person that comes in from people and their stories fill in pieces for us. Yeah. They're telling us things that none of the characters in the books could really share with us because they're giving a different perspective. They're pulling back the curtain on the characters that we know right now. Was that something that you planned from the start, or did you realize you needed to be able to say this about Alison or this about Clive as you were telling the story?
Yeah, I mean, such a good question. So yeah, throughout the book there are these 2 or 3 page sections that are first person, almost monologues or testimonies from, Alison's high school teacher, or, Clive's childhood friend, or like a girl who lived on the island with him who he wasn't really friends with, an actor who starred in a reenactment of the story of Alison's death. All of these different people get to say their little piece. And no, that was pretty much the last thing I figured out about the book.
Wow. Okay.
I had written the book, and there were a few little places where the narrative voice just took this departure, and for like 3 pages you were in the perspective of Sarah, who is a character with whom Clive has a son, and there was just a little 2-page piece that just slipped into her perspective. And I loved it, and it felt really important to the story, and I really love her character, and I wanted her to get to kind of say her piece. But I said, it's too weird. It's just too random structurally. So I took it out, and for a while it wasn't in there, and it was just bugging me. I was like, that was really important to me, and it's really, she seems like a peripheral character, but to me she's a really important character, and I want readers to feel like she's a really important character. And that thinking of like, how can I get her back in, eventually led to this idea of, well, maybe there are lots of voices that we want to hear from. And so it's interesting that you were sort of saying that it's a technique for learning more about Alison, because you're completely right. It totally is. And yet that was not the way I was thinking about it. Was more kind of conveying this like global sense of how far this aftermath stretches. And so for each of these characters who, I think the first time you encounter any of these characters in the book, you don't think they're major. You don't think you need to pay too much attention to them. They're sort of just in the background. And then they get this moment to sort of seize your full attention as a reader and show you, just open out their whole life for you and give you a sense of, no, like this changed my life too, and here's how.
And I would say if there was a movie made, I would like to see it handled exactly like that. So you don't completely develop those characters because you don't need them, because what they come in and say is exactly what they need to be saying. And you don't need to know their whole story backwards, forward. You don't need he said, she said, back, forth, gestures. No. Just say your piece.
Yeah, and I will say it was the last big piece of writing that I did, but they came really quickly, and I think it was very clear to me when I was writing them, kind of, I don't know, I'm always a little sheepish about saying how late in the game I wrote them, because I now feel like they complete the book. And but sometimes that's how it works, you think you've sort of got the whole thing done, and then you figure something else out, and you feel like you're kind of closing the circle.
Well, it's like polishing the gaps. It's like you're polishing the gaps that are in between, and you're like, wait a second, this is something that could really enhance the storytelling. And it's also very different from a lot of books I've been reading. And I think that that's what makes the book even more special, is because you took a chance and did something different, and it completely worked. I mean, there are times where people go to do things, and it's like, why was that there? And here it just completely works.
Thank you.
And it's, it was just so much fun. Privilege is something that comes up a lot in the book. And it's like, these girls definitely know that they're privileged. They know that the boys that are sitting on the beach with their privilege. Everybody's privileged. But at the same time, they're questioning their privilege. They're questioning how easily life comes to them. And we have to remember also that this book was set in the 90s. The book was set during the 90s, which were the go-go 90s. That was where I mean, I always joke that, like, Vanity Fair was an extremely successful magazine, and one of it was because everybody was making money, and everything was happening hand over fist, and everything was opulent and big, which would not happen today. Everything is on a totally different plane. So setting it at that time and looking at privilege at that time, did you have to do some going back and saying what happened then?
Well, I think the thing that I was really interested in, and that feels like quite different from, I'm about Alison's age. So I think the thing that has always been really interesting to me, because I used to work with high school students, and so I was working with high school students, kids who are now 18, and who, were often from really privileged backgrounds. And the concept of privilege was not something when I was 16 that was sort of in the vocabulary of a typical 16-year-old who was very privileged. And so I think what's interesting to me for me is, I think teenagers now kind of have this vocabulary and are maybe a little more, I don't want to say adept, but there's more of a framework for them to be like thinking through these issues. And I think Alison is thinking through them kind of on her own and just figuring it out. So that was one thing I was interested in exploring. But, it's interesting just setting something in the mid-90s in general. We wouldn't tend to think of that as historical, and yet it required a ton of research for Alison's setting, but also on St. X, kind of figuring out like what music would have been popular, what
drinks would have been popular, what foods would have been popular,
what clothing was in style, all of that. It's
kale was
historical.
Not big.
It's historical, right? And what would have been on the menu at this resort at that time? So there was a lot of It's like it's not very long ago, and yet every detail is different
because there's so many trends. There's so many in things that were not, they were then and they're not now.
Yeah.
Like kale. So now for this research, did you really have to struggle and go to the Caribbean in the depths of winter and spend time down there? Because that would be a trial.
Yeah, I did go to the Caribbean in August. But it was incredibly helpful part of the research. This is obviously a pretty research-heavy book in general. So a lot of reading and all of that. But when I went to Anguilla, and when I was there, I was really lucky because I got to do a lot of interviews, and I got to talk to a lot of men and women who were pretty much the same age as Clive and Edwin and their friends, and just kind of hear their stories about what did you do with your family on Sundays? What were some things that you as teenagers would have done for fun? And also a lot about like how the island changed over the course, from their childhoods into, being in their 40s now. And that was really, interesting because essentially, when they were kids, their houses didn't have electricity and roads weren't paved, and now it's an island that is, just has tons of luxury resorts, and it's, there's much better, Wi-Fi everywhere, broadband than here.
The infrastructure has changed tremendously.
And but just getting to, talk to people and hear their stories was incredibly helpful.
Yeah. One time we were down, I remember we had done a sales meeting, it was in St. John, and they had a hurricane. Like literally they said to us, you are the last flight out of the island. Yeah. And the accounting department kept calling me going, where's the bill? And I was like, do you realize the island may not exist? And I said, if you've not been down there, you don't understand how a water event like this could really cripple this place for a very long period of time. And I think that what that would mean for the whole economy and everything that's going on. And we know a little bit more now because of things that have happened over the last couple of years. But even back then, the places were far more primitive in the 90s, which is when I spent more time down there, than they are now.
I definitely, the island in this, the kind of the history of the island in the story is one of like really rapid development. But I think also like something that was important to me in the story is I think there can be, that's this, I think it has that story, but I think there are moments when the tourists' kind of perceptions of, there's a moment in the story, right, where Alison's father, meets a woman who's from the island on the airplane and is kind of surprised that she's a lawyer. And so I think that too, right? Like, I mean, these are places where a lot of kids are going to college. A lot of them are going to college in the States. And so kind of bringing that into the story too.
Bringing that a different kind of conception.
Yeah.
There was such a significant age difference between the two sisters, which really ends up making, besides the fact that she's idolizing her sister, did you ever think about making them any closer in age? Because there's such a big gap, for the family, parents too.
I really didn't. I was just always so interested in, and maybe like some of it is just, I had friends growing up who had much older siblings, and that was fascinating to me. I was just, that sense of, what is that sibling relationship like when there's such a huge gap? I also think that I think there could have been a different and also really interesting book written about two sisters who were incredibly intimate and close with each other. But I think like so much of this book is about identity, and for Claire, like, her sister's identity is this mystery to her. And I don't think she fully realized it's a mystery until the book starts to unfold. I think she spent a lot of her growing up years feeling like she pretty much knew who her sister was, and she was this wonderful older sister who loved her, and then it's really only once her life intersects with Clive's and she starts kind of peeling back the layers of the past again that she starts to realize there's a lot I don't know.
And I may never know.
And then I may never know. And so I think their age gap was so pivotal to that it was just there from the beginning.
It was there right from the beginning. Did you write all the scenes in the Caribbean first and then Brooklyn, or did you go back and forth?
I wrote Clive's story beginning to end.
Okay.
It took me a really long time to figure out the structure of this book. Right. And so I really, the book sort of starts with him in second grade and takes you up to the present day when he's like about 40. So I wrote his life and just, growing up and his friendship with Edwin and his job at the resort, and then kind of coming to New York in the aftermath of Alison's death and his life in New York City. I wrote all of that together and then sort of threaded it through with...
Wow, with the family. So going back, so that's really interesting. So he was more the pivotal character at the thread between in the beginning, and then that's very interesting.
I found it easy. I just loved writing his story, and I just stayed with it and kept going. So.
Yeah, it's clear because people fall in love with him as you're going through, and people are saying they're rooting for him. They're rooting for him, and they're also trying to figure out where she is definitely tracking him and figuring out what's going on. It's got this edge to the whole thing of who's being followed and who's not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of definitely something I was playing with, right? He was with Alison the last night she was alive. He was one of the last people who saw her. And yet there's also something very sinister about what Claire is doing, kind of following him and observing him. So I think there is a bit of that kind of who can I trust here, and who, right, she's sliding into an obsession, and I think
that's exactly.
I think she feels, she's very deeply trying to discover the truth, and she's very genuinely trying to do that. But I think as she slides into this obsession, she kind of loses her grip on what she's doing and how she's doing it.
Yeah, and I mean, as you're the reader and you're going along with her, you're like, whoa, this girl's really going over the edge.
Yeah.
Wow, she's following him to these places and whatever. It becomes very much who's losing track and a grip on what's going on. But I almost felt like she needed to lose the grip because everything had been so unknown for her. It's almost like she had to completely unravel to come back to become whole.
I think that's really well put. I mean, I think of her as like secretly she's actually still 7 years old on some level. You know, she's moved on, she's built this life, and yet I kind of see this slide into an obsession as just almost this regression back to this place that she never really moved on from. Yeah.
And she's like, she's not going to work, she's going to do these things, and it's very irresponsible on her part, but it's almost like because nothing was solved way back when, there's way too many questions for her. And her parents have moved on in some ways. They haven't really moved on in that they still love the daughter that they've lost and everything, but they've built a different life for themselves. And she is stuck back in, I'm back here, I'm 7.
Right.
I'm 7 and I'm trapped.
Exactly. And so after Alison's death, their family they were in New York. They start completely over. They moved to Pasadena, California. Claire changes her name. She starts going by her middle name. So I think for her and for her parents, I wouldn't go so far as to say they're trying to forget Alison. They're really not. She's still just really upheld in this family. But there's a desire to just still live a life. And I think they're all, you know, on the surface, they seem to be doing that. But then that surface just kind of shatters.
And then there will be a question from someone of how many children do you have? And it will throw them. Because it's like, okay, do we have 2? Do we have 1? If we have 2, how do we describe the other one? What do we do? And I think that I feel that halting moment with them because they're still always going to have that feeling of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think their story, and I kind of made this very conscious decision not to make the parents very prominent characters because I think the grief of parents who have lost a child is just so enormous that it would almost suffocate the rest of the story. And so they are kind of intentionally decentered a bit. But I just, you know, I was really interested for them and for Claire how, you know, the sort of enormous grief that anyone has when they lose a sister or a daughter, how is that tangled up with and compounded by the fact that she's famous, right? She's famous in death, and people who don't know her think they know her, and people on the internet are still like getting together in chat groups and trying to solve this crime. How does all of that layer into their grief? And
what you've got too is then Clive has left the life that he's known as well. So you've got her parents have moved on there. She's in a different place. He's in a different place. And where all these different places are, and have you really escape your past? And you really can't. It's how you come to terms with what's going on in the past, not escaping it.
I think for me, haunting is a word that I just think of again and again when I think about the book. But I think they're haunted by the past, and they're also kind of haunted by who they were in that past. And they've tried to, for a lot of them, I think, for Clive, for Claire, for their parents, they've tried to outrun like who they used to be and rebuild themselves and reinvent themselves. And there are minor characters with storylines that are not connected to Alison at all who are also living that same arc of trying to outrun some version of themselves, and yet they're just relentlessly themselves, and there's some part of yourself that you can never start over from. So, yeah.
Well, last week in preparation for this, I started listening to the audiobook again because I realized that I'd read the book a while ago and I wanted to get myself back in tune with the characters, especially after meeting you when we were in Baltimore a couple of months ago. And I sat there and I was like, wait, I really want to do this. So the audiobook is spectacular. It's got this 14-person cast. And it's really terrific. Did you have any input on the cast?
I did, and I don't know if that's normal for an audiobook. I have no idea. I had the producer at Macmillan Audio was amazing and would just keep asking for my input, and so I just kept giving it. So I don't know how common that is, but I felt incredibly lucky. I was able to kind of give notes. So all of those little 2-page monologues have a different actor. And so I was able to say, well, you know, I think this character might have a little bit of a raspy voice or something, and they would find someone who had that. And so I think the audiobook is so cool, and I'm so excited about it. And I think it's a book that kind of, because it's a full cast reading, it really lends itself to that. So I'm really excited about the audio.
When you hear the extra voices dropped in, they're even more powerful than reading on the page in a
Yeah.
lot of ways, because you're actually hearing the accents, or you're hearing whatever the person was saying, their just their pacing of their voices or whatever.
Yeah.
There were very clear choices in who was selected. So I just think it was wonderful.
It was a blast to be involved in. I love doing it. Yeah.
And have you listened to it, or is that hard?
It's mostly really hard. I've dipped in. I've listened to some of each of the 14 voice actors because I just was so excited, but I haven't listened to the whole thing through, and I'm not sure if I ever will.
Authors sometimes say that they read their books aloud these days to themselves because they see that they use a word too much. Because with audio becoming, especially digital audio, becoming so big, if you don't have the right cadence, if you don't have the right pitch or something like that, it's going to show up. But they say that then you never want to listen. It's like authors that are reading, they say you have to read what's on the page. Like some authors who narrate their own audiobooks, they go, no, you have to say what's there, not intersperse the word you want there now.
Yeah, I cannot imagine narrating my own audiobook, but I felt really lucky that this had the cast it did, and I think they did a really amazing job.
Yeah, if anybody is going to listen to it on audio, it's a real treat, because those different voices coming in that are these 2-page vignettes just will give you so much more of a richer experience. Yeah. It's more like a cinematic kind of experience to the whole thing in an audio way.
Yeah, I mean, I really imagined the book as sort of having this effect of a chorus of voices, and so I think it lends itself really well to the audio format.
Well, I know you're probably working on something next, and I also know, and we always like to do a little treat when we can, that you've always said that if you could write, you would write in a candy bar. So someplace, and I was just picturing like in Dylan's candy bar.
That I do eat. I eat a lot of candy while I write. It's true.
So
it's what keeps me going.
Did a Valentine selection here. We think it works well with the cover
amazing.
here. This will be for you. We have this bag for you to take.
Thank you.
So you can continue to write. Can you tell us? I know we don't like to ever if you're not ready to talk about anything. What are you working on?
Sure. Well, I'm working on my next novel.
Can I have a piece of candy then?
Yeah, I am. I'm like the chewy gummy ones are my favorite, but probably not the best for the interview. So I'm going to have a candy corn, which is also my favorite.
Much better. You can chew. It's like fine. I was like so excited about this. When I saw this was going on, we were like.
No, because I said in that interview that my ideal would be a cafe that has pick and mix candy, and I really truly mean that.
So we can just set it up. So what we should do is, in your next contract with your book, it has to be a candy selection arrives each week. You will specify what's in it. It will be sent to you.
Well, but it's totally from when I was in college, because the student center in college, there was a cafe, and then across the hall there was a candy thing. And I think I'm so trained from studying for exams and writing papers with candy that now I just kind of require it. But the next book, I'm really early in it, so I wouldn't say too much, but it's really different in terms of like plot, but I think it kind of shares sort of tone and atmosphere with St. X. It's there's a driving mystery to the whole story, and it's kind of has that same like haunted atmospheric tone to it. So I would say tonally and stylistically it shares a lot, and it's set in a really isolated, I guess that's the only thing I'll say, is it's set in a really isolated town where nobody ever leaves. And it's not quite a real place, but it's sort of
another place than you imagine.
Yeah, and so far it only has one narrator. So that's another
We'll
thing that would make it very different. Yeah.
See what happens. I still think that you should take this book on vacation. I think part of your tour should be to go to the Caribbean in winter. I mean, we're now in February, and I feel like the research in August was fine, but celebrating the book has got to be over the winter.
Well, I am going to be at Anguilla the Lit Fest in Anguilla in May, which I'm really, really excited about.
It'll still be dark enough here. It'll be danky enough here. It'll be totally, totally perfect.
Right.
I am so glad to have met you. I know that I'm meeting you on your first book, and I know there's so much more to come from you. I can just see from reading this. And thank you so much for coming along today.
Thank you so much. This was really fun, Carol. Thank you.
And to our viewers, we look forward to seeing you next time. And everyone, you do want to read St. X or listen, one or the other. And now we're going to leave her with her candy. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank you.